The transmission I am about to record will end my career. I know that now. But I have spent my professional life documenting the deaths of civilizations, and what I witnessed above that blue planet was not a death. It was something the Galactic Council has never seen, and something I believe it will never recover from understanding. My name is Valith Sohn. I am a junior diplomatic analyst assigned to observation vessel Cathara, and this is my account of what happened when the Draken Confederacy invaded Earth. I was sitting at my monitoring station when the slipspace ruptures began tearing open across the system. 1,200 warships poured through in staggered formation, their hull signatures painting my sensor display in angry red clusters that spread across the screen like a hemorrhage. 4 planet crackers anchored the fleet's center line, each one a vessel so massive that its gravitational shadow distorted the sensor readings of the ships around it. Every one of those 4 ships carried enough firepower to split a continental plate in half. I had seen formations like this twice before in my career. Both times, the target species had been eradicated within 72 standard hours. I pulled up my documentation template, entered the date, and began filling in the preliminary fields with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this too many times. The Draken Confederacy controlled over 400 worlds. Their military doctrine was simple and had never failed in the 4 centuries since they had first achieved interstellar capability. Arrive in overwhelming force. Broadcast a single demand for total surrender. Destroy resistance from orbit. Occupy whatever remained. They had perfected this sequence across 46 separate conquests, grinding entire civilizations into compliance with a method so reliable that their military academies taught it as settled science rather than strategy. Their supreme commander, a decorated veteran named Torvan, had personally overseen 11 of those conquests. He had never lost a campaign. He had never been forced to retreat. He had never encountered a species that survived more than 14 days after his fleet entered their system. In Draken military culture, he was considered not just successful, but inevitable. Earth had been targeted for its subsurface mineral deposits. Long-range geological surveys conducted by automated probes had detected concentrations of rare transition elements buried deep beneath the planet's crust, elements that were critical to slipspace drive manufacturing and increasingly scarce across the known galaxy. The species living on the surface, classified by the Galactic Council as Category 6 pre-spacefaring, was considered irrelevant to the resource extraction plan. They had no faster-than-light capability, no energy shielding, no orbital defense platforms. They had managed to place a few crude satellites in their own orbit and had sent a handful of remotely operated vehicles to neighboring planets. By galactic standards, they were barely worth cataloging, let alone consulting. The Council had voted 11-1 to observe the invasion without intervention, standard protocol for pre-contact civilizations. We were not permitted to interfere with the natural progression of galactic territorial expansion, and the Draken had filed their conquest claim through proper administrative channels. It was legal. It was routine. The paperwork was in order. The only dissenting vote had come from Ambassador Rethke, an elderly Olani diplomat who had spent the better part of 40 years studying long-range signal intercepts from the target system. He had stood before the council chamber and told them, in a voice that trembled not with age but with conviction, that the species on that planet broadcast mathematics wrapped in something he could only describe as controlled insanity. He said their radio signals carried patterns that suggested a civilization perpetually at war with itself and with its own environment. A civilization that had turned conflict into an art form and survival into a cultural obsession. Nobody had taken him seriously. The vote was recorded, the observation mission was authorized, and Rethke's warning was filed in the Council's archive alongside centuries of other ignored dissents. I certainly had not given it a second thought. Torvan's flagship, the Burning Reach, took position at the center of the formation and opened a broadband communication channel directed at the planet's surface. His message was the same one the Draken had used for 4 centuries, tested and refined across 46 successful conquests. Surrender all territory. Surrender all mineral rights. Submit to permanent occupation and resource extraction. Resistance would be met with total annihilation. He gave them 1 standard hour to respond. I leaned back in my seat and started drafting the preliminary sections of my extinction report. Species designation. Homeworld coordinates. Estimated population. Projected timeline for complete pacification. Recommended post-conquest environmental remediation protocols. I had done this before, and the familiarity of the template was almost comforting in its routine. I knew every field by heart, knew exactly which sections would require sensor data, and which could be completed from existing survey records. I estimated I would have the preliminary draft finished before the hour was up. The response came in 11 minutes. I expected silence, perhaps confused electromagnetic bursts, as their primitive communication networks overloaded with panic. Maybe a single frightened transmission from whatever passed for their central government, begging for terms they could not possibly negotiate from a position of such complete weakness. I had seen every variation of this moment across my 4 previous observation assignments, and the script never changed. Shock, denial, panic, capitulation, always in that order. What I received instead was 43 separate transmissions from 43 different sources scattered across the planet's surface. Military installations, civilian broadcast towers, naval vessels at sea, underground facilities that had not appeared on any of our preliminary scans, orbital communication satellites relaying signals from mobile ground units, even individual transmission units that appeared to be operated by private citizens broadcasting from personal equipment, and every single one of them said the same thing. No. Not a negotiation, not a plea for mercy or a request for clarification, not a conditional refusal with room for discussion or a diplomatic counteroffer designed to buy time. Just no. 43 times, in over a dozen different languages, from every populated continent on the planet. No. The word landed on my monitoring station like a physical impact, and I sat staring at my display trying to process what I was seeing. In my entire career, across every observation assignment and every historical record I had studied during my training, I had never witnessed a species issue a unified refusal to a superior military force. Fragmented resistance was common. Panicked attempts at negotiation were expected. Isolated pockets of defiance were routine and generally burned themselves out within hours. But a flat, simultaneous, planet-wide rejection, delivered within minutes of receiving an ultimatum from 1,200 warships, was something I had no framework for, something that did not exist in any of my training materials, or any precedent in the Council's 600 years of records. One transmission in particular caught my attention. It originated from a naval vessel on the planet's largest ocean, a surface warship of modest size and clearly outdated design, and it did not contain words at all. It was a 6-second audio clip that my translator struggled to categorize before finally labeling it as vocalized amusement. The crew of a naval vessel that was sitting directly beneath 1,200 enemy warships with planet-killing weapons had responded to the demand for their total surrender by transmitting the sound of laughter. I flagged the anomaly in my preliminary report and noted it as psychologically atypical behavior for a species facing extinction-level military force. Then I adjusted the projected timeline. A unified refusal suggested organized resistance, which meant pacification might take slightly longer than average. I added an additional 48 hours to my estimate and returned to my documentation template. Torvald did not wait for the hour to expire. The refusal seemed to offend him on a level that went beyond military protocol, as though the simple act of saying no to the Draken was an insult so fundamental that it required immediate correction. He ordered the bombardment to begin. The first wave of kinetic strikes launched from the 4 planet crackers simultaneously. Each projectile was a dense tungsten composite rod accelerated to a fraction of light speed, designed to penetrate any atmospheric envelope and deliver catastrophic seismic energy to the surface below. I had watched these weapons flatten mountain ranges. I had watched them boil lakes into vapor and turn fertile plains into sheets of molten glass that glowed for weeks after impact. They were the Draken's signature instrument of conquest, the opening note of every symphony of destruction they had ever conducted, and they had never failed to produce immediate, total devastation. I watched the projectiles enter the atmosphere, trailing superheated plasma as they burned through the outer layers of the planet's thick atmospheric shell. Impact projections filled my screen. 3 major population centers on the largest western continent, 2 on the eastern landmass, 1 cluster targeting the northern industrial zones where the mineral deposits were densest. I began recording the thermal signatures for my report, my fingers moving across the controls with practiced steadiness. The strikes that hit land did what kinetic weapons always do. The detonations were visible from orbit, massive expanding circles of light and heat that erased everything within their radius. Cities that had existed for centuries vanished beneath columns of fire and superheated debris. Infrastructure that had taken generations to build collapsed in seconds. I documented the destruction with the clinical precision I had been trained to maintain, recording population density estimates, infrastructure damage assessments, and projected casualty figures. Millions of thermal signatures winking out in an instant, each one representing a life that had ended so quickly the individual would never have known what killed them. This was the part of my job I had learned to perform without emotional engagement. It was necessary. It was data. It was my function. But the strikes that hit the ocean did something I had never seen before. My sensor officer, a quiet Palathi named Dren, was the first to notice. He made a sound I had never heard him make in 3 years of serving together. A sharp intake of breath followed by a trembling vocalization that roughly translated to a denial of what his instruments were telling him. I looked at his display and felt the same impossible confusion lock into my thoughts like a physical weight settling behind my eyes. The bombardment rounds that had entered the planet's ocean had detonated at a depth of approximately 900 meters. And they had simply stopped. Not deflected by a shield, not absorbed by a defense system, not scattered by countermeasures. The energy had dispersed into the water and vanished. The ocean floor beneath the impact points was completely intact. No cratering, no seismic disruption, no residual thermal signature, beyond what the surrounding water could account for through natural absorption. Nothing. I ran the sensor data 3 times, then I ran it twice more with different calibration settings. The results were identical each time. The kinetic energy from weapons that could crack a continent apart had been absorbed by the planet's ocean, as if the world itself had swallowed the blow and shrugged it off like a minor inconvenience. Dren looked at me with an expression I recognized as fear, not the controlled apprehension of a professional facing unexpected data, but genuine, primal fear of something he could not explain and could not rationalize within the framework of everything he understood about physics and warfare. I told him to keep recording and turned back to my own station, where I quietly deleted the preliminary extinction report I had been drafting. Something was profoundly wrong with our assumptions about this planet, and I was beginning to suspect that the Draken had made the same catastrophic error the Council had made when it classified this world as unremarkable. My hands were not steady as I opened a new file and began writing a very different kind of report. I pulled every geological and atmospheric dataset the Council had ever collected on Earth and ran them through the classification filters we used for high-risk worlds. These were the filters that identified death worlds, planets whose environmental conditions were so extreme that any species evolving on them would be forged by constant existential pressure into something fundamentally different from civilizations that developed under more hospitable conditions. The analysis took under 3 minutes, and when I read the results, I understood why Ambassador Rethke had voted against observation. I understood why he had tried to warn the Council, and I understood, with a cold clarity that settled into my chest like a blade of ice, that the Draken Confederacy had just invaded the most dangerous planet in the catalogued galaxy without bothering to read its full environmental profile. Earth's magnetosphere was nearly 4 times stronger than the galactic average for habitable worlds, generated by a molten iron core so massive and so active that it wrapped the entire planet in an invisible cocoon of electromagnetic force. Its atmosphere was a corrosive oxygen-nitrogen mixture that would eat through unprotected Draken hull composites within weeks of sustained exposure, an atmosphere so chemically aggressive that the species living beneath it breathed it voluntarily and considered it pleasant. Its surface gravity was 14% above the median for inhabited worlds, which meant every creature that evolved on that planet had done so under constant physical strain, building denser bones, thicker muscles, and cardiovascular systems designed for endurance under relentless downward pressure. The planet's axial tilt produced extreme seasonal variations that subjected its inhabitants to temperature swings that would be classified as environmental hazards on most Council worlds. Its tectonic plates were actively mobile, generating earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis with a frequency that suggested the planet was trying to shake its inhabitants off its surface. And the ocean, the vast body of liquid that covered over 70% of the planet's surface, was composed primarily of water, a compound with a thermal absorption capacity so extreme that it functioned as a natural kinetic energy sink on a planetary scale. The Draken had fired continent-killing weapons into a substance that could drink the energy and remain essentially unchanged. I sat with this data for a long time, reading the numbers over and over, trying to find an error that was not there. The planet was a fortress, not designed, not engineered, not constructed by any intelligence, but shaped by billions of years of geological and atmospheric evolution, into a world that punished weakness and rewarded adaptation with the merciless efficiency of natural law. Everything that lived on Earth had survived because it was tough enough to survive on Earth, and the species that had risen to dominance had done so by being tougher, more adaptable, more creative, and more relentlessly persistent than everything else on a planet where everything else was already extraordinarily dangerous. Then I looked up at the tactical display and watched as Torvon, apparently unfazed by the ocean's refusal to cooperate with his weapons, shifted his bombardment pattern to concentrate exclusively on landmasses and population centers. The second wave of kinetic strikes hit harder than the first. Entire cities vanished beneath columns of fire and debris that rose through the atmosphere like pillars of destruction visible from space. Mountain ranges crumbled, river systems boiled and evaporated in seconds. Agricultural regions that had fed millions were reduced to blackened wastelands. The thermal cost on the surface was staggering, and I recorded it all with the mechanical precision of a machine, while something inside me that I could not name and had never felt before began to tighten like a cord being slowly wound around my chest. But even as the destruction mounted, even as the casualty estimates climbed into figures that made my display scroll continuously to accommodate new data, something else was happening on the surface, something the Draken were too focused on their bombardment patterns to notice. Ground-based launch signatures began appearing across the planet's surface. Missiles, crude chemical propulsion systems that burned volatile liquid compounds for thrust, the kind of technology the Draken considered obsolete by several centuries. Torvon's tactical officers flagged them and dismissed them within seconds. Human rocket technology could not penetrate Draken hull shielding. The energy output of their most powerful missiles was orders of magnitude below what would be needed to damage even the lightest warship in the fleet. The launches were classified as a futile gesture of defiance, and the tactical staff returned their attention to the bombardment sequence. They were not targeting the ships. I tracked the missile trajectories with growing disbelief as I realized what the humans were doing. Every single launch was aimed not at the orbiting fleet, but at the debris field that the bombardment itself had created. The expanding clouds of shattered rock, vaporized metal, pulverized concrete, and superheated particulate that now hung in low orbit, like a belt of destruction encircling the planet. The missiles were not weapons in any conventional sense. They were delivery systems, pushing the debris into specific orbital corridors, compressing it into dense bands of material, traveling at velocities that made conventional shielding irrelevant. A Draken light cruiser, designated Stormfang, entered one of these corridors during a routine patrol sweep. The ship's commander had no reason to be concerned. The debris was catalogued as inert material, the natural byproduct of kinetic bombardment, and posed no threat to a shielded military vessel under normal circumstances. But the humans had compressed the debris into a density that transformed it from scattered fragments into a solid wall of shrapnel traveling at 14 kilometers per second. The Stormfang hit that wall and disintegrated. The debris tore through its hull like needles through wet cloth, shredding the vessel from bow to stern in less than 2 seconds. 300 Draken crew members ceased to exist so quickly that the ship's distress beacon never had time to activate. One moment, the Stormfang was a functional warship conducting a patrol. The next moment, it was a cloud of expanding fragments that added their mass to the very debris field that had destroyed them. I replayed the collision data 7 times, adjusting the playback speed each time, watching the moment of impact from every available sensor angle, and felt something I had not experienced since my first observation assignment, when I was barely old enough to hold the rank. Genuine, fundamental shock. Not surprise, not disbelief. Shock. The kind that rewrites your understanding of what is possible and forces you to accept that everything you thought you knew about a subject was incomplete. The humans had taken the Draken's own bombardment debris and weaponized it. They were creating what my tactical database identified as a cascading orbital denial field, a self-sustaining belt of destruction that would grow denser and more lethal with every new collision, feeding on its own wreckage to generate an increasingly impenetrable barrier around the planet. It was an elegant, ruthless, and devastatingly simple strategy. The Draken could not stop it without ceasing their bombardment, which would surrender their primary tactical advantage. And every kinetic round they fired added more material to the debris field, making it stronger, denser, and more dangerous. They were using the Draken's own weapons to build a wall around their planet. I contacted the Council for the first time since the invasion had begun. My scheduled report was not due for another 12 hours, but protocol no longer seemed relevant. I transmitted a single message flagged as Priority Advisory. Recommend immediate reclassification of Species 4479. They are engineering their own orbital denial field, using enemy ordnance as raw material. This is not pre-spacefaring behavior. This is adaptive tactical engineering, conducted under active bombardment, with no preparation time, and no prior experience with orbital warfare. The Council's response arrived 40 minutes later, routed through 3 layers of bureaucratic processing that stripped my priority flag and reduced my urgent advisory to a routine status update. Continue observation. Classification review requires a formal quorum and cannot be convened during an active territorial action. File supplementary data with the Analytical Division for review during the next scheduled assessment cycle. I read the response twice, then closed the communication channel and stared at the words on my screen until they blurred. The Council had spent 600 years building procedures designed to handle every conceivable situation, and those procedures were now actively preventing them from recognizing a situation that no one had ever conceived of. On the tactical display, Torvon was pulling his fleet back to high orbit. The orbital debris field had claimed 19 ships in under 6 hours, and the rate of loss was accelerating as each collision generated more shrapnel, that generated more collisions, that generated more shrapnel, in an expanding cycle of destruction. The Supreme Commander, who had conquered 11 worlds, was being pushed away from this one by what amounted to flying garbage, and the frustration was beginning to show in the tightening patterns of his fleet repositioning. But the retreat from low orbit created a different problem for the Draken, one that became apparent within hours. During the bombardment window, when the fleet had maintained low orbital positions to maximize targeting accuracy, Torvon had deployed ground forces. 200,000 Draken soldiers had descended to the surface in armored drop pods, landing across 4 continents with orders to secure key resource extraction sites and eliminate organized resistance before it could consolidate. Those soldiers were now on the surface of a death world, cut off from close orbital support by their own fleet's debris field, surrounded by a hostile biosphere that was attacking their equipment at the molecular level, and facing a species that had just demonstrated the ability to turn orbital bombardment into an orbital weapon with nothing but chemical rockets and an understanding of physics that the Draken had apparently never bothered to acquire. And then the oceans opened. I detected the first signatures rising from beneath the waves on the planet's western hemisphere: submarines. Primitive pressure-hulled vessels designed for deep-water operations, powered by systems that ranged from diesel combustion engines to compact nuclear reactors. They had been down there the entire time, hidden beneath hundreds of meters of water that no orbital scan could penetrate, silent and patient, while the sky burned and the cities crumbled, and the bombardment shook the seabed above them with impacts that must have been deafening inside those cramped metal hulls. They surfaced in coordinated waves across every major ocean basin, dozens of vessels appearing simultaneously, like predators rising from a depth that had concealed them perfectly. They launched cruise missiles at low altitude, weapons that streaked across the water's surface following terrain-hugging trajectories designed to avoid detection. But these missiles were not aimed at the orbiting fleet. They were aimed at the Draken ground forces, the 200,000 soldiers who had been deployed during the bombardment window and were now scattered across 4 continents in forward operating bases that had been established with the assumption that orbital superiority would protect them from any significant counterattack. The precision of the strikes was surgical. The submarines had not simply hidden and then attacked indiscriminately. They had waited for a specific moment, the moment when the Draken ground forces were most extended, most committed, and most vulnerable to a coordinated assault from a direction they had never considered. They had let the Draken land. They had let them establish their bases. They had let them commit soldiers and equipment to the surface. And then, they had emerged from the one place on the planet that was invisible to orbital surveillance, and struck with a timing and accuracy that spoke of careful planning, meticulous coordination, and absolute patience. I began searching through the Council's historical intercepts of human communications, looking for anything that might explain this level of preparedness. What I found made the tightening sensation in my chest compress into something close to physical pain. They had plans for this. Not theoretical discussions in academic journals, not speculative scenarios debated by their scientists. Actual operational contingency plans, stored in military databases, distributed to command structures, integrated into training programs, and practiced in regular simulation exercises. Detailed protocols for responding to an invasion by a technologically superior extraterrestrial force, covering everything from initial contact to guerrilla resistance to long-term occupation survival strategies. The plans were decades old. Some elements predated their space program entirely. They had been developed, refined, and maintained across multiple generations by a species that had looked up at the stars and thought not how beautiful, but what if something up there wants to hurt us? I recorded a personal log entry that I knew would never be included in any official report. They have contingency plans for alien invasion, pre-existing ones, maintained and updated regularly. They have been preparing for us before they knew we existed. They prepared for us the way they prepare for hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, as an inevitability to be survived rather than a catastrophe to be mourned. This species does not hope for the best. It prepares for the worst, and it has done so for its entire recorded history. My hands would not stop trembling as I saved the file. I stopped writing formal reports on the fourth day, not because I had given up my duties, or because I had decided to abandon my professional obligations, but because the Council's reporting templates did not contain fields for what I was witnessing. There was no drop-down menu for a species that fought like this, no category for the things they were doing to the Draken ground forces, no checkbox or data field, or standardized descriptor in 600 years of galactic observation protocols for a pre-spacefaring civilization that responded to orbital bombardment by becoming more organized, more efficient, and more dangerous with every passing hour, as though the act of being attacked had activated some dormant capacity that the species carried inside itself, like a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. The ground war had turned into something that defied every predictive model in my training database. Torvon had landed 200,000 soldiers across 4 continents, expecting to pacify a traumatized, disorganized population still reeling from the shock of orbital bombardment. What those soldiers found instead was a species that had spent its entire recorded history fighting wars against itself. A species that had developed, tested, refined, and perfected the most sophisticated, adaptable, and ruthless ground combat doctrines in the known galaxy, and had done so not through theoretical study, but through centuries of practical application against the most dangerous opponent they had ever faced, which was each other. I monitored Draken field communications around the clock, recording and translating every transmission that passed through frequencies my equipment could access. The reports coming from the surface read like dispatches from a nightmare that the commanders on the ground could not wake up from. Units that had been briefed to expect scattered civilian resistance, disorganized and poorly armed, were instead encountering coordinated military formations that had assembled and deployed within hours of the bombardment. Not days, not weeks, hours. The humans had mobilization protocols so deeply embedded in their social and institutional structures that the transition from peacetime civilian population to organized fighting force happened with a speed and efficiency that the Draken simply could not process. In the northern regions of the planet's largest eastern continent, a Draken armored column of 800 soldiers advanced on what orbital intelligence indicated was a major population center. The briefing had described the target as a civilian administrative hub, likely depopulated by the bombardment, potentially containing residual infrastructure useful for establishing a forward command post. The column commander expected to find refugees sheltering in damaged buildings, demolished transportation networks, and perhaps a few dozen armed civilians attempting futile resistance with primitive projectile weapons. What he found was a city that had been converted into a layered defensive fortress in under 72 hours. Every major intersection was barricaded with vehicles, construction materials, and debris arranged in patterns that channeled approaching forces into predetermined kill zones. Every elevated structure contained observation teams, feeding real-time intelligence to coordinated defense units, positioned throughout the urban grid. Underground tunnel networks that the Draken's orbital scans had never detected, because they were built beneath the streets at depths that orbital sensors classified as geological substrate, hid ascensive positions across the entire city, allowing human fighters to appear at one location, engage the enemy with concentrated fire, and then vanish into the tunnels before the Draken could bring their superior firepower to bear. The defenders would emerge minutes later at a completely different position, attack again, and disappear again, creating the impression that the city contained 10 times more fighters than it actually did. The armored column lost 200 soldiers in its first 3 hours inside the city limits, and had not identified a single fixed defensive position to target. I intercepted a transmission from the Draken field commander, a veteran officer named Grelthin, who had served with distinction in 6 previous planetary conquests, and who was widely regarded within the Confederacy as one of their most capable ground warfare specialists. His voice carried a quality I had never heard from a Draken soldier in any recording, in any archive, across any of the 46 conquests the Confederacy had ever conducted. He was not angry. He was not frustrated. He was not issuing confident tactical assessments or requesting specific reinforcements. He was frightened, genuinely, deeply frightened. He reported that the humans were not fighting like a species under invasion. They were fighting like a species that had been expecting this, that had rehearsed for this, and that the precision and coordination of their response suggested every single civilian in the city knew exactly what their role was and had known it long before the first kinetic round had fallen from orbit. I investigated this claim and discovered a concept that existed within the humans' own publicly available records, something they called civil defense. It was not a military secret. It was not classified information restricted to their armed forces. It was a formalized, publicly documented, and widely taught system of preparation for large-scale conflict that involved not just military forces, but the entire civilian population. Shelter construction and maintenance protocols, emergency supply distribution networks, with pre-positioned caches of food, water, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Broadcast protocols for disseminating information to the population during active hostilities. Medical triage procedures designed for mass casualty events. Resistance doctrine for populations living under enemy occupation. Psychological preparation programs that taught civilians how to maintain morale and social cohesion during prolonged bombardment. And all of it, every manual, every procedure, every training module and instructional guide, and emergency protocol, was publicly available to any citizen who wanted to read it, study it, or practice it. The humans did not merely have a military, they had a civilization that treated war as an environmental condition, like severe weather or seismic activity, something that could not be prevented and could not be avoided, but could be prepared for, adapted to, and survived through collective effort and individual determination. They had institutionalized this preparation across their entire society, so deeply and so thoroughly that the response to an alien invasion looked, from the outside, almost routine. And they had been preparing not for years, or for decades, but for centuries. Generation after generation, refining their doctrines, updating their protocols, learning from every conflict they had ever fought against each other, and applying those lessons to an ever-expanding library of contingency plans that covered scenarios ranging from conventional warfare to nuclear exchange to biological attack to, as I had now confirmed, invasion by a technologically superior extraterrestrial force. On the 6th day of the invasion, I intercepted a broadcast that changed my understanding of this species permanently. It was not a military transmission. It originated from a civilian radio frequency in a region that had been heavily bombed during the initial bombardment, and it was being broadcast on an open channel that anyone with a functioning receiver could access. A woman was speaking in a calm, measured voice, that carried the steady rhythm of someone who had done this many times before, someone accustomed to explaining complex information to an audience that needed to understand it quickly and apply it immediately. The content of her broadcast was a detailed technical manual, read aloud, for disabling Draken combat armor using materials and tools available to the civilian population. She explained precisely where the joint seams in the armor were weakest, identifying specific anatomical connection points where the plates overlapped, and describing the angle of attack most likely to separate them. She identified the optical sensor clusters mounted on the helmet's forward face and mapped their blind spots, explaining that the Draken visual spectrum did not extend into the infrared range, and that heat-emitting decoys placed at specific distances could overload their targeting systems. She listed household chemical compounds that, when combined in carefully described ratios, produced a corrosive solution capable of dissolving the polymer seals around the armor's helmet visor in under 30 seconds, exposing the wearer to the planet's corrosive atmosphere. She described the resonant frequency of the armor's short-range communication array and provided step-by-step instructions for modifying a standard civilian radio transmitter to broadcast a jamming signal on that frequency, cutting off individual soldiers from their unit's tactical network. This information had not existed 6 days earlier. No human scientist had ever studied Draken technology before the invasion. Every piece of data in that broadcast had been derived from captured equipment, analyzed by human researchers working under bombardment conditions, tested against field observations provided by fighters who were actively engaging Draken soldiers in combat, and compiled into a practical operational guide that was then broadcast to the entire planet on a frequency that any surviving radio could receive. I checked the broadcaster's identification signal. Her name was Sophie Lane. Her listed occupation in the regional civilian database was primary education instructor. She was a school teacher who was calmly and methodically reading instructions for neutralizing alien combat armor on public radio while her city smoldered around her, and her voice did not waver, did not tremble, did not carry even the faintest trace of the panic or despair that my training told me should be the dominant emotional state of a civilian in her circumstances. I sat in my monitoring station and stared at the sensor display and felt something fundamental crack inside the shell of professional detachment I had maintained for my entire career. I had documented 4 extinction-level events before this assignment. I had watched species die. I had recorded the collapse of civilizations with clinical precision, filling in templates, and checking data fields, and organizing sensor readings into neat categories that made the end of entire worlds look like an administrative process. I had filed my reports and collected my commendations and moved on to the next assignment because that was my function, and I had performed it without emotional engagement because emotional engagement was considered a liability in my profession. But I had never watched a species refuse to behave as if it were going extinct. The Draken took a major city on the southern continent on the 8th day. It was their first significant territorial gain since the ground invasion had begun, and Torvon broadcast the victory across the fleet's communication network as evidence that the campaign was progressing, despite the setbacks in orbit and on the ground. What he did not broadcast was the cost. The Draken had committed 12,000 soldiers to take a city defended by a combined force of military personnel and armed civilians that numbered fewer than 3,000. The battle had lasted over 40 hours. The Draken had sustained a casualty rate of nearly 40%, and they had not truly taken the city at all, because the humans had simply changed the terms of the engagement. The defenders retreated underground. Beneath the streets of every major human city, I had now learned, there existed extensive networks of tunnels, transit systems, maintenance corridors, sewer lines, and utility passages that formed a subterranean infrastructure almost as complex as the surface city above it. These networks had been built over decades for civilian transportation and municipal services, but they served equally well as a defensive labyrinth that the humans knew intimately and the Draken did not know at all. For the Draken, who had evolved on open grassland plains with excellent long-range vision, and who fought most effectively at distances where their superior optical sensors and ranged weapons provided maximum advantage, subterranean combat was a sensory nightmare. They could not use their orbital fire support underground. They could not deploy their armored vehicles in tunnels designed for human-sized transit cars. Their height advantage became a liability in low-ceilinged passages. Their visual acuity was useless in near-total darkness, and the close-quarters nature of tunnel fighting negated every technological advantage they possessed, reducing every engagement to a contest of speed, reflexes, spatial awareness, and tolerance for confined spaces in which the humans held every single edge. The casualty ratio in the tunnels was 30-1 in the humans' favor. Torvon contacted the Galactic Council directly on the 9th day. The Supreme Commander of the Draken Confederacy, conqueror of 11 worlds, veteran of 4 decades of military campaigns that had never produced a defeat, stood before his communication array and demanded that the Council intervene. Not against the humans. For the humans, he accused the Council of deliberately misclassifying Earth as a Category 6 world, in order to lure the Draken into an unwinnable conflict. He claimed the Council had known about Earth's true defensive capabilities, and had allowed the invasion to proceed as a covert strategy for weakening the Confederacy's military power. The Council was genuinely baffled. They had not misclassified anything deliberately. They had simply never looked at the planet closely enough to realize what they were looking at. Earth had been surveyed once, over 2 centuries ago, by an automated probe that had spent less than 6 hours in the system before moving on to the next target. The probe had collected atmospheric composition data and basic biological scans, detected a pre-industrial civilization with no spacefaring capability, and flagged the world as unremarkable. Nobody had ever gone back to check, because nobody had ever had a reason to care. The Council informed Torvon that his invasion was a sovereign military action, undertaken at his own risk, under the established protocols for territorial expansion, and that the Council bore no legal or ethical responsibility for the accuracy of intelligence that the Confederacy had failed to gather independently. They suggested he consult with his tactical staff regarding operational adjustments. Torvon disconnected without responding. That same evening, I received a private message from Ambassador Rethke on a secure diplomatic channel. It was brief, just a single line of text. "Now do you understand what I heard in their radio signals?" I did. I understood it completely and irrevocably. What Rethke had heard in those intercepted broadcasts all those years ago was not insanity at all. It was the sound of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting to survive on a world that was trying to destroy it, and had emerged from that crucible with a defiance so fundamental to its nature that it could not be separated from its identity any more than breathing could be separated from its biology. The mathematics Rethke had detected was precise and disciplined, the product of minds that understood the universe in rigorous detail. The madness was the refusal to accept any outcome other than survival, regardless of the odds, regardless of the cost, regardless of whether survival was even theoretically possible by any rational assessment. On the 11th day, as I was compiling my latest collection of unfiltered observations into a document that no official template could contain, my censor officer Dren called out in a voice that had gone completely flat, with the particular quality of shock that comes from seeing something your mind cannot immediately categorize. A new energy signature had appeared on the planet's surface. It originated from a coastal facility on the western edge of the largest northern continent, a facility that had survived the bombardment either through luck or through deliberate concealment. The signature was not a weapon. It was a launch. The humans were putting something into orbit. I focused every available sensor on the rising object and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a spacecraft, but it looked like nothing any spacefaring civilization in the galaxy had ever produced. Its hull was a patchwork of components that appeared to have been pulled from at least 3 different vehicle types and welded together with more determination than engineering precision. Its propulsion system was a chemical rocket engine that burned with a dirty, inefficient flame, trailing a column of white exhaust. Its structural integrity readings were so low that my systems flagged it as a debris hazard rather than a functioning vehicle. It was heading directly for the Draken flagship. There were 6 humans aboard. I could see their biosignatures on my medical scanner. 6 heartbeats, steady and measured. 6 sets of lungs, breathing in a rhythm that suggested calm, focused concentration rather than panic. 6 bodies, strapped into acceleration seats, inside a vehicle that had been assembled in a war zone in under 2 weeks by a species that had never built an interstellar spacecraft before. Their radio was broadcasting on an open channel, and the message required no interpretation, no cultural context, no diplomatic analysis. It was a statement, broadcast in clear language that my translator rendered without difficulty. You started this. We are finishing it. I scanned the vessel for weapons. I scanned it 3 times, adjusting my sensor parameters each time, looking for concealed ordnance or shielded warheads, or any energy signature that might indicate armament of any kind. I found nothing. No missile tubes, no energy projectors, no explosive payload, no targeting systems. Nothing that any weapons classification database in the known galaxy would recognize as armament. The ship was the weapon. 6 human beings had strapped themselves into a crude spacecraft built from salvaged parts and industrial adhesive, and aimed it at the most powerful warship in the Draken fleet, with the intention of striking it at orbital velocity. They had done this knowing, with absolute certainty, that they would not survive the impact. They had made this choice not in the chaos of battle, not in a moment of desperate last resort when all other options had been exhausted, but as a calculated tactical decision made by people who had alternatives, and chose this one because it was the most effective option available. I opened a channel to the Council and transmitted a single word that I knew was inadequate but was all I could manage. The word was, help. Nobody answered. The spacecraft struck the burning reach at 4.2 kilometers per second. It impacted the flagship's main engine housing at an angle that my trajectory analysis confirmed had been adjusted multiple times during the approach, corrected and refined by human hands operating manual thruster controls during the final minutes of flight. The 6 people aboard had spent their last moments alive, ensuring that their aim was as precise as physically possible, making calculations and adjustments that required mathematical focus and steady hands, knowing that each correction brought them closer to a target they would never survive reaching. The collision did not destroy the flagship. The Burning Reach was a capital warship, constructed to withstand direct combat with other spacefaring civilizations, its hull layered with composite armor and ablative plating designed to absorb kinetic energy far greater than what a single crewed spacecraft could deliver. But the impact achieved exactly what its designers had intended. It crippled the primary engine array, shearing the main thrust housings from their mounting brackets and sending fragments of the propulsion system spiraling into the surrounding fleet, like secondary projectiles. It ruptured 3 internal decks and vented their atmosphere into the vacuum of space, creating cascading depressurization events that forced emergency bulkhead closures across an entire section of the ship. It destroyed the secondary power distribution grid that fed the flagship's long-range targeting systems, reducing Torvon's ability to coordinate orbital fire support for his ground forces by over 60%. And it killed 214 Draken crew members in compartments that had been rated as secure against all known weapons. The 6 humans aboard did not eject. They did not attempt to divert at the last moment. They did not broadcast any final message or farewell. They aimed. I watched the aftermath unfold on my sensor display and recognized, somewhere beneath the professional analytical framework that was trying and failing to process what I had just witnessed, that I was experiencing the early stages of psychological shock. The tactical damage to the Burning Reach was significant, but not strategically fatal. The ship could still function as a command platform. Its communication systems were intact. Torvon was alive and capable of directing fleet operations. From a purely military assessment, the attack had achieved a moderate tactical result at a disproportionate cost to the attackers. But the psychological effect was something that could not be measured by any sensor on my ship. The Draken had conquered 46 worlds across 4 centuries of interstellar warfare. In the entire documented history of their military campaigns, across hundreds of engagements against dozens of species with varying levels of technological sophistication, no enemy had ever used a crewed vessel as a kinetic projectile. The concept existed in their tactical databases as a theoretical possibility, cataloged under a classification that translated roughly as terminal desperation behavior, a tactic that might be employed by a species in the absolute final moments of its existence, when every other option had been exhausted and extinction was not merely possible, but certain. It was considered an act of total defeat, the last spasm of a dying civilization, noteworthy only as a data point confirming that the species in question had been completely broken. The humans were not losing. The ground war had turned decisively in their favor across 3 continents. Their orbital denial field had confined the Draken fleet to positions so distant from the surface that effective fire support was no longer possible. Their submarine forces had systematically destroyed the supply lines that connected the Draken ground troops to their orbital logistics chain. Their civilian population was actively dismantling Draken operations from within occupied territories, using crowdsourced technical intelligence and improvised weapons that grew more sophisticated every day. By every measurable metric, the humans were winning. They had momentum. They had tactical superiority on the ground. They had strategic control of the orbital environment. They were winning, and they had done this anyway. I began searching through the human historical records I had compiled during my observation period. What I found explained everything, and made everything worse simultaneously. The humans had a long, extensively documented, and culturally celebrated tradition of voluntary sacrifice in combat situations. Soldiers who threw themselves onto explosive devices to shield their companions from the blast. Pilots who aimed their damaged aircraft at enemy warships when their weapons failed. Medical personnel who refused to evacuate hospitals that were under direct fire. Ship captains who stayed aboard sinking vessels to ensure their crews escaped. Civilians who placed their own bodies between armed aggressors and complete strangers they had never met, making themselves targets to give others time to flee. It was not desperation. It was not a symptom of psychological breakdown. It was doctrine. A deeply embedded cultural framework, taught in their schools and celebrated in their literature and memorialized in their architecture, that treated self-sacrifice not as a last resort of the defeated, but as a tactical option available at any point in a conflict, to any individual, at their own discretion. The humans had a concept for it that my translator struggled to render in any galactic language, because no galactic language had a word for it. The closest approximation was voluntary acceptance of personal destruction for the preservation of the collective. They used this concept casually. They taught it to their children through stories and historical accounts. They built monuments to individuals who had practiced it and named their streets, their ships, their institutions, and their public spaces after them. They considered it not tragic, but honorable, not wasteful, but meaningful. Torvon broadcast an address to his fleet within an hour of the impact. His voice carried the forced steadiness of a commander who was maintaining authority through volume rather than confidence. He condemned the attack as barbaric. He called it the act of a species too primitive to understand the rules of civilized warfare. He declared that Earth would be pacified within 72 hours, regardless of cost, and ordered his remaining forces to intensify operations across all theaters. 3 of his subordinate commanders responded by withdrawing their battle groups without authorization. The withdrawals were simultaneous, which meant they had been coordinated through private communication channels that Torvon had not been monitoring. Each withdrawing commander transmitted a formal protest to the fleet record, citing what they described as unacceptable operational psychology from the enemy. They were not retreating because they lacked the combat power to continue fighting, though by any honest military assessment the campaign had become unsustainable. They were retreating because they did not want to engage a species that was winning and still chose to die. The distinction was profound. A desperate enemy was predictable, because desperation narrows options. A victorious enemy that deployed the tactics of the desperate was something their training had not prepared them to face, and they refused to continue learning what it meant in real time. Torvon executed one of the retreating commanders via remote activation of his vessel's self-destruct charges, a command authority that all Draken Supreme Commanders held over their subordinate ships, precisely for situations involving unauthorized withdrawal. The explosion flared across my sensor display and was gone. It was meant as a demonstration of absolute authority, a reminder that insubordination carried consequences more immediate than any enemy could deliver. The message was clear: retreat without orders and die. The remaining 2 battle groups continued their withdrawal without pause. Within 6 hours, 3 additional subordinate commanders had broken formation and begun moving their ships toward the system's outer boundary. The Draken fleet that had entered the system, 1,200 warships strong, was fracturing along lines of fear that Torvon's authority could not hold together, because the fear of their commander was a rational, calculable thing, and the fear of the humans was something else entirely. On the surface, the balance had shifted so completely that the remaining Draken ground forces had abandoned offensive operations entirely. They were no longer trying to conquer territory or secure resource extraction sites. They were trying to hold the positions they had already taken, fortifying their bases and consolidating their perimeters, and they were failing at that too, because the humans never stopped attacking, not for rest, not for regrouping, not for any of the operational pauses that military doctrine required for sustained campaigns. They attacked in shifts, rotating fresh units into engagement zones, while exhausted fighters withdrew to rest and rearm, maintaining constant pressure around the clock, with a logistical efficiency that suggested they had been practicing this kind of sustained operations for generations. The humans had also begun using captured Draken equipment, and the speed at which they integrated alien technology into their own forces was something my technical officers described with words that alternated between professional admiration and undisguised alarm. Human soldiers were carrying Draken pulse rifles that they had not merely figured out how to fire, but had actively modified. They had recalibrated the targeting optics for human visual ranges, adjusted the grip ergonomics to fit human hands, and in several documented cases had improved the energy efficiency of the weapon's power cell by altering its discharge cycle in ways that Draken engineers had not considered in centuries of iterative design. They had cracked the Draken squad-level communication frequency and were broadcasting false orders on it. Tactical directives that sounded authentic enough to pass initial scrutiny were flooding the Draken communication network, ordering units to relocate to positions that did not exist, reporting enemy contacts in sectors that were empty, and issuing contradictory commands that caused units operating in adjacent areas to fire on each other. Friendly fire incidents multiplied exponentially. Unit cohesion collapsed. Draken soldiers who had maintained discipline through weeks of grinding combat began refusing to follow orders because they could no longer determine which orders were real and which had been fabricated by an enemy that understood their communication protocols better than many of their own operators. I submitted a formal emergency recommendation to the Council on the 12th day. I used the strongest language available in the diplomatic lexicon and flagged the transmission with every priority marker my clearance level permitted. My recommendation was blunt. Cease observation immediately. Initiate mediation between the Draken Confederacy and Species 4479. Offer the humans protectorate status under the Council's charter before they developed slip space capability independently. Because every hour I spent watching them reverse engineer Draken technology brought that moment closer. And when it arrived, the balance of power in this galaxy would shift in ways that no existing diplomatic framework was prepared to manage. The Council's response came from 12 senior diplomats who had clearly not read my observation logs, or, if they had not understood them. They informed me that a Category 6 civilization could not, by definition, pose a strategic concern to the Galactic Council. My recommendation was denied. My priority flags were stripped. I was reminded that my role was observational, and that emergency recommendations from junior analysts required endorsement from a senior diplomatic officer before they could be formally reviewed. Something inside me shifted when I read that response. It was not anger, and it was not despair. It was the quiet, clean sensation of a load-bearing structure reaching its failure point and separating into two pieces that would never fit together again. On one side was the analyst who followed procedures and filed reports and documented the deaths of civilizations without emotional engagement. On the other side was the person who had watched a schoolteacher read instructions for defeating an alien army on public radio and understood, with a certainty that no report template could express, that this species deserved better than to be watched from orbit while it fought for its survival. I transmitted my complete unedited observation logs to every member of the Galactic Council simultaneously, all 12 days, every sensor reading, every intercepted communication, every personal note I had recorded in the margins of my official documents. I flagged the transmission as a Priority 1 threat assessment, a classification that had not been invoked in over 600 years and that automatically triggered an emergency session of the full Council, regardless of scheduling, regardless of procedure, regardless of whether any senior diplomat endorsed it. The emergency session convened within 4 hours. I was ordered to present my findings, but before I could speak, before the Council chamber had finished its procedural formalities, Dren called out from his station. A second human spacecraft had launched from the surface, larger than the first, better constructed. Its propulsion burned cleaner, suggesting the humans had incorporated elements of captured Draken technology into its engines. It had been built in under 2 weeks in the middle of a war by a species that had never produced an interplanetary vessel before. It was heading not for the Draken fleet, but for the Council observation vessel. It was broadcasting a formal hail on our diplomatic frequency using encryption protocols that should have been unbreakable by any species below Category 3. They were requesting a meeting. I stood in the observation vessel's docking bay and watched the human spacecraft execute an automated docking procedure that my flight control officer described, in a tone of reluctant professional respect, as flawless. The vessel approached on a trajectory that reflected extensive mathematical modeling, matched our rotational velocity with a precision that left zero margin for error, and locked into our docking collar with a mechanical contact that echoed through the bay like the closing of a door that could not be reopened. Behind me, arranged in a semicircle of diplomatic formality that looked increasingly fragile with every passing second, stood representatives from 7 council member species who had joined the emergency session via holographic projection and insisted on being present for whatever was about to happen. Their images flickered slightly in the docking bay's overhead lighting, and I could read on their faces a spectrum of reactions that ran from practiced institutional composure to poorly concealed terror. Ambassador Rethke was there in person. He had commandeered a fast courier vessel from the nearest relay station and crossed 3 systems to reach the Cathara before the humans arrived, moving with a purposeful urgency that seemed incompatible with his age, but perfectly consistent with the determination of someone who had spent 40 years warning people about a danger that was now standing at the door. He positioned himself at the front of the diplomatic receiving line, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carrying the precise quality of vindication that belongs to someone who was right when everyone else was wrong, and takes no pleasure in it because being right has come at too high a cost. The docking collar pressurized. The inner seal cycled through its safety sequence. The hatch opened. 3 humans stepped into the bay. I had studied this species through sensor data and intercepted communications for nearly 2 weeks. I had analyzed their biology, their behavioral patterns, their combat doctrine, their communication styles, and their technological adaptation rates. I had built detailed profiles and predictive models and psychological assessments based on thousands of individual data points collected under conditions that should have provided comprehensive understanding. None of it prepared me for sharing physical space with them. They were smaller than I expected. My species averages roughly 2 meters in height, and the tallest of the 3 humans barely reached 1.8 meters. But their physical presence filled more space than their bodies accounted for. They moved with an economy of motion that communicated constant, effortless awareness of their surroundings, each step placed with a precision that spoke of a species accustomed to navigating terrain that could hurt them at any moment. Their eyes, forward-facing predator eyes, set in flat faces, with pronounced bone structures designed to protect the brain from impact, tracked across the docking bay in scanning patterns that my training recognized immediately as threat assessment. They were evaluating the room the way a soldier evaluates a battlefield, identifying exits, obstacles, potential cover, and the positions of every individual present, and they were doing it so naturally that it appeared casual. 2 of them wore military uniforms bearing insignia I could not read, rank markings in a system I had not yet decoded. One was a man with broad shoulders and close-cropped hair the color of sand, whose posture suggested a career spent carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain. The other was a woman slightly shorter than her companion, with sharp features and steady hands that rested at her sides, with the specific relaxation of someone who could turn those hands into weapons at any moment, and was choosing not to. Both carried themselves with the rigid, controlled bearing of professional soldiers, who had been fighting continuously for 2 weeks, and were operating on discipline rather than rest. The third human was a civilian, a woman of medium height with dark skin and close-cropped black hair, wearing a formal suit that was creased and lightly marked with dust, but had been maintained with meticulous care despite the circumstances of its journey. She carried no weapons. She carried no documents or recording devices or diplomatic credentials. She carried nothing except a calm, focused intensity that I could feel from across the docking bay, like radiant heat from an unshielded reactor. Her name, I learned moments later, was Kamara Osei. She did not introduce herself with pleasantries or diplomatic preamble. She looked at the assembled council representatives, then at me, then at Ambassador Rethke. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, not loud, not aggressive, not pleading, not performing. Steady in the way that structural foundations are steady, bearing enormous weight without visible deformation. She spoke as someone accustomed to saying important things to powerful people and expecting those things to be heard. She said that 12 days ago, the Draken Confederacy had attacked Earth without provocation. She said the attack had been conducted under a conquest claim filed through the Galactic Council's own administrative systems, which confirmed the Council had been aware the invasion was coming before it began. She said the Council had chosen to observe rather than intervene, had stationed an observation vessel in the system to document the expected destruction of human civilization, and had refused repeated requests from at least one of its own members to reconsider this decision. She paused here and looked directly at Rethke. The old ambassador met her gaze without flinching, and something passed between them that I could not interpret but that seemed, from the outside, like mutual recognition between two people who had both been shouting warnings into rooms full of deaf ears. Osei continued. She said the humans did not require the Council's assistance. The Draken ground forces were in full retreat across 3 continents, surrendering in growing numbers as their supply lines collapsed and their communication networks became unusable. The orbital debris field had rendered the Draken fleet operationally ineffective, confined to high orbit positions from which they could neither support their ground forces nor conduct further bombardment. Captured Draken technology was being integrated into human military and scientific systems at a rate that would achieve functional technological parity within months rather than generations. She said the purpose of this meeting was not to request help. The Council representatives shifted in their positions. One holographic projection flickered as its source made an involuntary movement. The silence in the docking bay took on a quality of tension that I could feel pressing against my eardrums, like a change in atmospheric pressure. Osei said the purpose of this meeting was to ensure the Council understood something that the humans considered essential to any future interaction between their species and the galactic community. Earth was attacked by a Council member state. The Council was aware of the attack in advance. The Council chose to watch. The Council assigned an analyst to document the expected extinction of the human species. The Council took notes while human cities burned, while millions of human beings died, while the survivors fought with everything they had against a force that the galaxy's most powerful diplomatic institution had decided was not worth opposing. And the humans noticed. She let that statement fill the silence for a long time before continuing. She said the humans were not issuing threats. They were not demanding reparations, though she noted with precise diplomatic restraint that such demands would be well within their rights under the Council's own charter governing species, subjected to unprovoked military aggression by member states. They were not seeking vengeance or positioning themselves for retaliation. What they wanted was simpler than any of that and more difficult to dismiss. They wanted the Council to know that the humans knew. They knew the Council had been there. They knew the Council had watched. They knew that the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy had observed the attempted destruction of human civilization with the detached professional interest of researchers studying a natural disaster on an uninhabited world. "You watched us burn," she said, "and you took notes. We do not need your help anymore. We need you to understand that we know you were here." The silence that followed was the deepest I have ever experienced in any setting, diplomatic or otherwise. It was not the contemplative silence of people considering a complex argument, nor the shocked silence of people processing unexpected information. It was the silence of a room full of powerful beings, arriving simultaneously at the realization that they had committed an error so fundamental it could not be corrected, and that the species they had wronged was standing before them, composed and measured, and completely uninterested in their justifications. A senior council delegate, a Tarvian ambassador whose name I choose not to preserve, attempted to respond with procedural language. He cited the Council's non-intervention protocols for pre-contact civilizations. He referenced the legal frameworks governing observation missions. He explained, in tones of practiced diplomatic superiority, that the Council's actions had been conducted in full compliance with established guidelines, and that the human's emotional response, while understandable from a primitive cultural perspective, did not constitute grounds for formal diplomatic complaint. Osei did not interrupt him. She let him finish speaking. She let his words fill the bay and settle into the record. Then she turned to me. She asked if I was the analyst assigned to document the expected extinction of her species. I said yes. She asked if I had been ordered to prepare an extinction report before the invasion began. I said yes. She asked if, in my professional assessment, the Council's classification of Earth as a Category 6 world had been accurate. I looked at the Council representatives standing behind me in their semicircle of institutional authority. I looked at Rethke, whose expression had not changed, but whose eyes held something that might have been hope or might have been grief. I looked at the two human soldiers standing behind Osei, their predator eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my secondary cardiovascular system activate. Then I spoke. I confirmed everything Osei had said. I stated, on the record, before the full emergency session of the Galactic Council, that I had been assigned to document the extinction of species 4479, that the Council had refused to intervene, despite clear evidence that the Draken invasion violated multiple provisions of the Charter governing proportional military action, that I had submitted emergency recommendations that were dismissed without review by senior staff who had not read my observation data, that I had been told by 12 senior diplomats that a Category 6 civilization could not pose a strategic concern. And then, I said what I had wanted to say since the 6th day of the invasion. I said that the humans had defeated a 400-world military power, using chemical rockets, ocean physics, welding tools, industrial adhesive, and the willingness to die standing. I said they had accomplished this without allies, without advanced technology, without faster-than-light capability, and without any assistance from the galactic community that had known about the invasion and chosen to observe it from a safe distance. I said that the Council's classification system was not merely inaccurate but meaningless, that a framework incapable of identifying the most formidable species in the galaxy was not a tool but a blindfold. The chamber erupted. Several delegates demanded my immediate dismissal from the diplomatic service. Others called for a formal inquiry into the observation mission's protocols. Two representatives from smaller member species quietly transmitted motions to open independent diplomatic channels with Earth, motions that were immediately buried under procedural objections from the larger powers who controlled the Council's agenda. Ambassador Rethke stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply rose to his full height, which was considerable despite his age, and the chamber quieted, because Rethke had served longer than any living delegate, and when he chose to speak, the weight of those years compelled silence in a way that no procedural rule could. He said 4 sentences. The analyst is correct. We failed. They survived anyway. That is what should terrify you. The chamber fell silent, and into that silence came a new transmission. Torvald's voice filled the room, broadcast from the burning reach on a frequency that reached every ship in the system and every communication relay in the sector. And for the first time since I had begun monitoring his communications, the Supreme Commander of the Draken Confederacy sounded afraid, not angry or defiant or calculating. Afraid. He ordered a full and immediate withdrawal. All Draken forces, orbital and surface, were to disengage and retreat to the system's outer boundary for emergency slipspace transit. He offered no tactical rationale. He cited no strategic objective. He simply ordered his fleet to leave, and the urgency in his voice made it clear that the order was not a tactical decision, but an act of survival. Then he broadcast a final message, addressed not to his forces, but to the Council. His voice was flat and hollow, in the way voices become when the speaker has accepted a truth they did not want to learn. Strike this world from your maps. Declare it forbidden. No one should come here. No one. He said it twice. The Draken fleet, reduced from 1,200 warships to fewer than 300 operational vessels, began its withdrawal. I watched them go on my sensor display, their formation ragged and broken, their engine signatures flickering with accumulated damage and system strain. They left behind the wreckage of 900 ships, the orbital debris field that had helped destroy them, and 200,000 soldiers on the ground, who would surrender over the following weeks, in groups that grew larger, as word spread that the fleet had abandoned them. Kamara Osei watched the withdrawal on the observation vessel's main display screen. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She did not make any statement for the record, or offer any commentary on the retreat of the force that had tried to exterminate her species. She stood with her arms at her sides and watched the fleet that had burned her cities and killed her people limp away into the darkness between stars, and her expression carried something I could not classify in any emotional taxonomy I had been trained in, but that I recognized, much later, as grief. Not for the Draken, for her own people. For the millions who had died in the bombardment before any defense could be mounted, for the 6 who had aimed a welded spacecraft at a warship and never considered any outcome other than the one they chose, for every human who had fought and suffered and died to defend a planet that the rest of the galaxy had considered beneath notice and not worth protecting. She turned to me before she left the observation vessel. She spoke quietly, in a tone that had shifted from diplomatic to personal, as though she were speaking to me rather than to the office I represented. She said the humans did not want council membership. They did not want galactic technology. They did not want recognition or formal apologies or seats at diplomatic tables where decisions were made by species that had watched them burn and done nothing. She said they wanted to be left alone. She said it simply, without emphasis, as a statement of preference that was also, unmistakably, a warning. I told her I understood. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her deciding whether she believed me. Then she turned and walked back to her ship. The 2 soldiers followed her, the docking collar sealed, the human vessel detached from the Cathara, and began its descent toward the planet below. I stood at the observation port and watched. The spacecraft, that small, improbable, welded-together vessel that had been built in a war zone by a species meeting the galaxy for the first time, dropped through the void toward a planet that was scarred and dark and burning, in places where the bombardment had torn through everything the humans had built across centuries of civilization. But as I watched, points of light began appearing on the night side of the planet, small at first, scattered and isolated, individual structures restoring power from backup systems or emergency generators. Then clusters formed, neighborhoods, and districts and industrial zones coming back online as repair crews worked through the wreckage. Then chains of illumination spread along the outlines of continents, connecting the clusters into networks, rebuilding the grid that the bombardment had shattered, pushing the darkness back one light at a time. The invasion was not officially over. Draken soldiers were still surrendering on 3 continents. The orbital debris field still encircled the planet in a belt of destruction that would take years to clear. The cities that had been struck by kinetic weapons were still smoldering, their ruins still cooling, their dead still uncounted. And the humans were already rebuilding. They were restoring power before they had finished counting their casualties. They were repairing infrastructure before the enemy had fully withdrawn. They were doing what they had always done, what they had been doing for the entire history of their species on that impossible, violent, beautiful world. They were refusing to stay down. I recorded my final observation log that evening in the quiet of the monitoring station, speaking slowly and choosing each word with the deliberate care of someone who understands that what they are saying will outlast them. I said that I came to this system to document the death of a civilization, and instead, documented something the galaxy has never witnessed. A death world species that did not merely survive first contact with a superior military force, but adapted faster than the enemy could escalate, fought with tools and tactics that no classification system could anticipate, and won a war against a 400-world empire using nothing but the resources of a single planet and the absolute, unshakable refusal to accept any outcome other than survival. I said that the humans had not asked for membership in the galactic community. They had not asked for advanced technology or diplomatic recognition or any of the things that every newly contacted species in recorded history had sought. They asked for one thing, to be left alone. And I said that I believed, with a certainty that sat in my chest like a stone that would never dissolve, that the galaxy would not be wise enough to grant that request. Because the galaxy has never been wise, it has been powerful, and it has confused that power for wisdom, and it has never encountered a species capable of teaching it the difference. I paused the recording. I looked out at the planet one final time. The lights were still spreading across the night side, still growing, still multiplying with a stubborn, relentless persistence that seemed, from this altitude, like the visible manifestation of everything I had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. Every act of defiance, every improvised weapon, every calm voice broadcasting instructions on open frequencies, every human being who had looked at the impossible and decided to fight it anyway. Then I finished my log with the only conclusion my data supported, the only statement that captured what I had seen in language simple enough to survive translation into every tongue in the known galaxy. They did not win because they were stronger. They won because they simply refused to lose. And I do not know what the galaxy does with a species like that. I saved the file. I closed my station. I sat alone in the darkened observation bay and watched the lights of Earth grow brighter, one by one, spreading across the darkness like a pulse returning to a heart that had been struck but not stopped. And I wondered whether the Council would listen to what I had recorded, or whether it would do what it had always done, file the report, archive the data, and learn nothing until it was far too late to matter. The lights kept spreading, the humans kept rebuilding, and somewhere in the silence between stars, the galaxy had changed, whether it was ready to admit it or not.